Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start the program shortly, and I urge you to give your attention to the Crispus Attucks High School Elite Ensemble, who are going to be performing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Thank you. Crispus Attucks High School Elite Ensemble. Thank you for being here. The Battle Hymn of the Republic was especially moving. Birch, in fact, requested that it be sung at his memorial service. You know, I should say at the outset that while this is a memorial service, we're not in church. So it's okay to applaud, and it's very okay to laugh. Indeed, Birch remarked often how much he enjoyed his dear friend Ted Kennedy's memorial service and wished his could be similar. Well, Senator Kennedy's service was 3.5 hours long. So this one will be shorter, but I hope no less enjoyable. I'm Bill Morrow. I was a member of Senator Birch staff during his final 3 years in office. My 40-year marriage to Ann is the product of a secret romance that started in room 363 of the Russell Senate Office building. This caused our daughter Katie recently to tell a large group, "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Birch," and in response to the ensuing laughter quickly said, "My parents met while working for him." Not all of us who worked for the senator can say our families resulted from that service, but every one of us can say that our lives were changed forever and for the better, and that having Birch name on our resume served as a passport to the rest of our careers. Those of us who served with Senator during the final 4 years remember working very closely with the staff of Indiana's then junior senator, Richard Lugar. The close friendship that formed between the two senators carried over to the staffs. Didn't it, Mitch? And by the way, if we could kill the slideshow, that would be, thank you. In 1999, Evan assumed his dad's seat, and he became the junior senator. And that closeness between Richard Lugar and now the second generation of Senators continued. I see a few federal judges in the audience who are living proof of how two senators from the same state of different parties can put hyperpartisanship aside and work together. For the very There are young people in the audience who have to accept my words as an act of faith. There was, in fact, a time in the history of the United States of America when statesmen and stateswomen routinely worked across the political divide to address the challenges facing our country. And you know, that principle is evident in today's lineup of speakers. The genesis of this memorial service began with a very gracious call I received from Brian Bosma on March 13th, as the word spread that Birch Bayh was nearing the end of his journey. We'll want to do a memorial service in the Statehouse, Bill, the speaker told me, and the next day I heard the same message from the governor's staff. So in that spirit, that bipartisan, nonpartisan, perhaps a-partisan spirit, I would ask you to join me in a moment of silence for Richard Lugar, who truly was one of Birch Bayh's best friends. Thank you. Let me now recognize the distinguished Mayor of Indianapolis, Joe Hogsett, who has a proclamation to present. Mayor Hogsett.
Well, good morning. It's an honor as mayor of Indianapolis to bring greetings to all of you and proclamation to memorialize the life and times of Senator Birch Bayh. Governor, Speaker, thank you for making today possible. I won't read the proclamation to you because I assume that the following speakers will elucidate every single point several times over. Let me add just a few additional non-proclaimed observations about the life and legacy of Birch Bayh. We honor a great man. We honor a great man who, in this great state of ours, knew the location of every single Dairy Queen in Indiana. On one trip back from Vincennes with Senator Bayh, he and I stopped in the Dairy Queen at Farmersburg. I ordered my small chocolate shake. The senator was behind me in the tub of gallon vats of ice cream. And he pulled out two. Now, we were in Farmersburg, which, for those of you who know, is a long way away. And I was thinking to myself, well, at least one of those half-gallon canisters is going to melt before we get back to Indianapolis. But in Birch Bayh style. We got back in the car, and by the time we got back to Indianapolis, all the ice cream was gone. We honor a man who took me aside after his son was elected governor, called me close into his quarter and said, I want to give you the best piece of advice that I can give you as you assist my son in helping shape and guide our state over these next few years. And I thought, my land, Eureka, the keys to the kingdom. Here's the deepest secret I can possibly be shared. And the senator called me in and said, "Whatever you do, don't ever take on the township trustees." Yeah. In all seriousness, we will honor today, and you'll hear the word used quite often, legacy. We all owe a debt to Senator Birch Bayh because his is a living legacy that remains in all of us. His legacy lives on through the dedication of public service that he has passed on to this noble Hoosier family, a legacy personified by his son Evan, a legacy now personified by his grandsons, Nick and Bo. And as a final matter, as the father of a young girl, 14 years old, who is involved in, well, I think 300 sports, I feel I just have to offer my own personal thanks and gratitude for the senator because of the living legacy that is personified in each one of our sisters, our daughters, and our granddaughters. I think it all too fitting that a Hoosier saw the promise that sports held to lift up all women in America. So in typical Bill Morrow style, I've been given the hook.
Can you take this back with you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Some things never change. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for joining in this legacy.
Good job. Thank you. Well, Nancy Pappas and I were having a bit of a pool on how many people would show up today, and Nancy, you won. Thank you for your prediction. And so with a crowd this large, introductions are risky, but I will proceed nevertheless. Please hold your applause until I cue you. I won't introduce our speakers because we'll have a chance to thank them when they speak. Permit me to begin by introducing the former First Lady of Indiana, Judy O'Bannon-Wilsey, and former Congressman Lee Hamilton. Would you please stand and let us greet you? Senator Todd Young and former Senator Joe Donnelly are here. Please stand so we may say hello to you. Two great Indiana families that were very, very close to the Bayhs are here. The family of Larry and Mary Lou Conrad is represented by Amy Conrad Warner, Melissa Conrad, and Andrew Birch Conrad. The family of Wayne and Helen Townsend is represented by Alan Townsend. Would you please stand and let us greet you? Kelly Crosskoff, would you and your colleagues please stand? Okay, Kelly is the newest assistant general manager of the Pacers, emphasis on Pacers. She's the first female senior executive in the history of the NBA and a ferocious, huge Birch Bayh fan. That row back there is affectionately called Title IX row, so you can applaud again. I'd like to thank the presidents of Indiana University and Indiana State University, Michael McRobbie and Deborah Curtis, for being here. And for the record, the president of Purdue is here too. But if Presidents McRobbie and Curtis, if you'd stand and let us greet you, we'd appreciate that. On page 2 of your program, you will see a list of great Americans. When you first went to work for Birch Bayh, the term Great American sounded, well, a little disingenuous, but then you learn it's really quite an appellation. The great Americans who are listed on page 2 truly went the extra mile to pull this service together. Governor Holcomb, I hope you will note that your staff makes up a great number of those names. You should be proud of your team, and we are grateful. And a special shout out to Birch Bayh alums Nancy Pappas, Ann Latcha, Trish Whitcomb, and Bob Blameyer for their help with what was truly a labor of love. If you are on that list, please stand or wave and let us thank these great Americans. Current and former members of the judiciary, both state and federal, will you please rise and remain standing? Current and former legislators. Now, I'm supposed to cue you. Current and former legislators, both state and federal, please rise and remain standing. All other current and former elected officials, please rise and remain standing. Bart, that includes you. You can stand. Let's welcome these great public servants. I'm often asked what it was like to have worked for Birch Bayh. The answer to that question lies in the values he imparted to us. His service to the people of Indiana truly brought him great joy. He thought he was the luckiest man alive. So he had no use for staffers who were pouters or shirkers, I can tell you. He had incredible physical energy that he used to squeeze every moment out of every day. After a week on the road with him, us 20-somethings were completely exhausted, but he'd go for another 2 weeks. He expected loyalty, but he believed loyalty is not a one-way relationship, it's mutual. In politics, you often hear the word loyalty used in a way that's almost a cudgel. For us, it was glue. We were loyal to him, he was loyal in return, and he expected us to be loyal to each other. And we did have to learn how to like Dairy Queen, Joe. We really did. Dairy Queen became part of our diet. I have proof today of Birch Bayh's legacy. Those who worked for Birch Bayh on his staff or on one of his campaigns, would you please rise and remain standing? Would you hold your applause for a minute? If you worked on Birch Bayh's staff or on one of his campaigns, please stand and remain standing. If you worked in the administration or campaigns of Evan Bayh and Frank O'Bannon, would you please rise? If you worked on Evan Bayh's Senate staff or his campaigns, please rise. If you are the offspring of any of these people, would you please rise? See, Katie Morrow was right. None of us would be here if it weren't for Birch Bayh. Now, all of those, the rest of you, would you please stand as you are able and rise for the invocation, the presentation of the colors, and the Pledge of Allegiance, which will be led by General George Buskirk. As you recite the words to the pledge, I urge you to consider it as much a prayer as it is an oath. Reverend Harrison Jones. Thank you.
Before I begin, I want to say to this entire family that on behalf of the church family of Witherspoon Presbyterian Church, we extend to you our love and sincere condolences. The late senator was good friends with one of our former pastors, Reverend Leandrum Shields, and so the members of Witherspoon join you today in prayer and reflection. Let us bow our heads and pray to the Lord our God. O Lord our God, our dwelling place in all generations, we gather in solemn remembrance of the life and legacy of one who dared to dream and who stood as a moral witness to the high ideals of our nation's democracy. as there can be no discussion of musical genius without Rachmaninoff and Bach, as there can be no discussion of world-changing leadership without that of King and Mandela, as there can be no discussion of the great visual artists of humanity without Bearden, Modigliani, Catlett, and Cézanne, there can likewise be no registry of the great political titans of this age without that of Senator Bayh. For on today we celebrate the life of one who became a citadel for intellectual prowess, human compassion, and the power of a determined mind. As a towering advocate, he helped better the lives of millions of Americans and spent a lifetime building a future of inclusivity, fairness, and equality. As a consummate servant leader, he served this great state and the people of this nation with dedication and honor. We celebrate his life today, for he lived with wonderful dignity, stood upright with integrity, spoke with authority, lived in humility, and now rest in eternity. Above all, O God, his life exemplified the words of the Apostle Paul recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 1. If I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong and a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, O Lord, we are nothing. We thank you today for the vibrancy with which he led and for the indelible impact that he had. And yet, O Lord, we must confess to you today in utter honesty that we have not yet finished his defiant revolution. And so on this day, we take up his banner and cause as our own, understanding that the burden now falls on all who remain to continue the fight and be steadfast in his commitment as we live our lives with passion, humility, love, honor, and sacrifice. And so now, O Lord, inspire our hearts as we lift high the moral ideals of the work that you have called us to do. Guide us, bless us, lead us, and dwell with us. Amen.
Please join me, ladies and gentlemen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all for coming today. Requiem by Robert Louis Stevenson. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die. and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies, where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Bosma. I'm the current Speaker of the Indiana House. Have the privilege of holding the same office that Speaker Birch Bayh did 60 years later. Been a good friend of Evan's, occasional competitor, but always had felt a close kinship with Evan and his family, both of our families being second-generation public servants, and knowing what it's like to grow up in a political household. It sounds from Bill Moreau as though I volunteered to speak. I only volunteered to secure the facility. I had to discover that I was speaking at this memorial by reading about it in the Indianapolis Star. Checked with my staff, it was news to them as well, but I consider it a sincere honor and privilege to share a few words about a Hoosier statesman and icon that we're here to honor today. Bill and I were speaking on the phone yesterday. He was confirming that I was actually going to show up. And we talked for a few minutes about this feeling like the change of an era with two great senators and statesmen, both of whom we're honoring in part today, not being with us any longer. But I take heart in the fact that there are young statesmen and stateswomen who will fill these shoes in the future. So I didn't know the senator that well on a personal basis, but I felt like I did. My first job as a young law clerk was at Bayh, Tabbert, and Capehart. Fred Glass, the athletic director of IU, and I were the senior associates, or the senior law clerks. We were joined by some wet behind the ears gal that we were supposed to teach the ropes to. Ultimately, her name was Susan Brooks. So the three of us had a small closet-sized office over in the tower, and Dan Evans, one of the senior partners, walked in and said, Bosma, I want you to go out and pick up Senator Bayh at the airport. Well, I failed to tell Dan that my 78 Le Mans, it was a hot July day, did not have air conditioning. I also failed to tell him that I was a volunteer on the Dan Quayle 1980 Senate campaign, and I have the picture to prove it. I've showed this to a couple people. They said, a lot of hair, tight pants, and I look pretty good too. But when I picked up the senator, met him at baggage claim, and those of you who knew him well will know exactly what I'm talking about. I said, Senator Bayh, I'm Brian Bosma, a law clerk here, and I'm picking you up. Grabs me around the shoulder, pulls me tight, and says, oh hell, Brian, I know your dad. Call me Birch. Well, I said, well, yes, sir, Birch. But the next 20 minutes was all about me, and it was not one word about Birch Bayh. That's just the way he was. You all know the story of Senator Bayh's national career, but few perhaps know his General Assembly career. Back in an earlier day when in a kinder day, the General Assembly met 60 days out of 2 years, all at once. You still got paid for 2 years. Press loved you, building up democracy, a lot of collegiality. So he was first elected to a Vigo County, one of 3 Vigo County seats in 1954 rather, at age 26. I was 27, my first election. As a freshman, we look back at the record, he didn't author a single bill. Freshman, you know what that's like. But he co-authored 5 bills, all having something to do with Vigo County. He did receive some positive attention when a headline in the Indianapolis News says, Bayh's home rule fight wins praise. He was speaking on a resolution in support of home rule, not even legislation. In 1956, 2 years later, at the age of 28, Representative Bayh became the leader of the Democrat caucus, all 24 members of the superminority. And the historians say it was a 4-way race to get there. Now, how you divide 24, I mean 6 votes for each, perhaps. Matters changed in 1958 when the political pendulum switched and the 79-member Democrat supermajority elected a 30-year-old Birch Bayh as Speaker. So he's seen both sides of that superminority, supermajority equation. He gave only one speech as speaker, and I read it. It's recorded in our journal. Actually, I had a slight panic attack because I didn't realize the opening day speech is recorded verbatim in the journal. I've done 11 of them. I immediately took the one from this year out of my portfolio. I was told to mark it up. I'm marking it up this morning. Birch talked about increasing funding for K-12 education, putting more pay in teachers' pockets, tackling the growing narcotics problem. And following the session, his first political speech or reported speech after the session was, it was a tremendous session. We met all our goals, increased K-12 funding, increased pay for teachers, made progress on the narcotics situation. I gave the exact same speech last week. I also second, don't take on the township trustees. The only shortcoming in his agenda, he said, was they failed to achieve property tax reform and repeal right to work. A couple of us up here took those on 50 years later. In the 58th session was Birch's only chance to preside as speaker, as again, with the changing political winds, he was back to a minority of 34 members. I'd like to tell you that I either knew all of this personally or it's in the annals of discussed history here, but actually it's from an excellent article by Trevor Fowdy, who I know is here today, last month, that was entitled, Mr. Bayh Goes to Indianapolis, a look at Birch Bayh as state representative. I'm going to close with one of Trevor's opening comments and his closing comment. He said that in reviewing Birch's General Assembly, remember he told me to call him Birch, so I'm sticking with it. In reviewing Birch's General Assembly work, what emerges is the beginning of his legacy as one of the most brilliant and naturally gifted politicians our state has ever seen. And I second that. And he closed with the following. Our state and nation owe much to the late senator. He, in turn, owed much to the Indiana General Assembly that helped turn a Vigo County farm boy into a modern-day founding father. Thank you.
My name is Baron Hill, and I'm usually known as the person who followed Lee Hamilton into office. I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. I am, like all of you, very impressed with this crowd, and I'm glad, Nancy Pappas, that you won the bet, whatever that bet was. Crowds are overflowing. This is a very impressive crowd here this afternoon. It's in honor of the great Senator Birch Bayh. That having been said, there has been some people who could not be here that sent condolences, and I would like to have the opportunity to read some of the people who sent their condolences. Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania. I was blessed to have the opportunity to meet Senator Bayh at the weekly prayer breakfast. Senator Patrick Leahy. Birch is one of the senators I admired most of all the senators I ever served with. He was a senator's senator and was one who actually liked to get things done. He was totally honest with me and with everybody else who dealt with him. I learned so much from him. I have to think that many of the things I've tried to accomplish have been because of the wonderful example that Senator Bayh set. The Honorable Leon Panetta. Birch had an unerring eye for the needs of his time. He was a role model for how you get things done in Washington. It is a truism that while we should not judge the past by the standards of the present, we should always judge it by the standards of the best voices that we heard. Birch's voice was one of those very best heard. Lee Hamilton, at a ceremony dedicating the federal courthouse here in Indianapolis, Indiana, after Birch Bayh, made a few remarks that I did not know about until I heard those remarks. Birch's father was a basketball referee who reffed Lee's high school games that Lee won. Lee has always been fond of the Bayh family because of it. And then there was the time that Birch split his seam on his pants, boarding a helicopter in Connersville, Indiana, bound for Bloomington, Indiana. Lee went on to say that in one of the most remarkable displays of political gymnastics he had ever seen, he changed his pants on the helicopter and arrived in good shape in Bloomington, Indiana. And then Lee went on to say that Birch Bayh wrote more of the United States Constitution than any other member since James Madison. That is an accomplishment. And then there is Adrian Watson's tweet the day Birch Bayh died. I will never forget sitting in Barron Hill's office as an intern, folding reply letters to constituents. An old man came in early for a meeting and then sat with me. He helped me with the envelopes and asked me about the internship for 30 minutes. I had no idea it was Birch Bayh. That was Birch Bayh. That was typically Birch Bayh. And I want to publicly now apologize to the senator, and I know he's listening to this, for making him wait those 30 minutes on me. Birch would always come in and campaign with me when I had my congressional races. And it was always fun. We always had a good time. I remember one time in early or late October, it was very, very cold, freezing, snowing out. It was so cold in the car that my wife Betty said that you could hang meat in the car. She's an old farm girl. That tickled Birch quite a bit. He got a good laugh out of that. So where did Birch want to go? Joe Hogg said he wanted to go to the Dairy Queen when it was snowing outside. That's where Birch always wanted to go. We had some great times. I remember another time. We were down in Jasper, Indiana, and we were going to go door to door, knocking. It was election time. And it began to rain cats and dogs, and thunder and lightning. And so I suggested that we cancel the door to door. Lee, in his competitive nature that he had, and he was a great athlete, by the way, and as an athlete myself, I always respected that. But Lee says, we're not going to cancel this. Let's go to Kmart and get some rain gear, and we're going to go door to door. And that's exactly what we did. And I can remember in the Kmart, as we was trying on the rain gear, a crowd gathered around. Typically of Birch Bayh, he loved every second of it and made a great performance. And the people stood and gave him a standing ovation because of it. By the way, that year I won Jasper by the largest margin I've ever got elected to, and I credit it to Birch Bayh. You know, one last thought. When I think about the years that Birch spent in the United States Senate, he began to drift a little bit left in his political philosophy. And when I think of that, yeah, that's okay. When I think about that, I think about the poet, Robert Frost, when he said, I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, 2 pathways in the woods passed by, and I took the path less traveled by. When I think about Birch Bayh, I think that at the end of that poem, when he took the pathway less traveled by, it made all the difference. Birch Bayh, both as a senator and a person after the United States Senate, took the path less traveled by, and he made one hell of a difference.
What an honor to be here to recognize a phenomenal senator and family friend. My heart goes out to my good friend, Governor and Senator Evan Bayh and Susan, to Nick and Bo, GQ models, as well as great servants, to Chris and Jessica and Kitty, all of Birch Bayh's friends and family, far too many people to even fit into this room today. In times like these, especially, we would do well to remember the kind of leader he was. He called upon the best in us, not the worst. In the dark times and dark moments that every generation must endure, he sought out what President Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. For that, this city, this state, and this nation will be eternally grateful. We remember him today as a humble man whose words and actions captured the best of our state. He made us proud to be Hoosiers during a time when our state and our country were at a moral crossroads. Birch Bayh showed us that the truest and most enduring form of leadership is not found in ego, not in strength, not in violence, but in a courage that is anchored in love and humanity. Here at home, he stood up for fairness and equality for all people. Even when this wasn't the most popular position, he took that spirit to Washington, D.C., and helped change the course of our nation's history. In 1962, the year he was first elected to the Senate, John F. Kennedy stood before America and took us into a new frontier, a time when Americans believed anything was possible, that our best days were right in front of us. But the shackles of discrimination were holding us back and continue to hold us back. Birch Bayh, a white man from a state that was once the epicenter of the Ku Klux Klan, fought discrimination in the halls of Congress with every fiber of his being. I believe the greatness of America is found in its resilience and redemptive soul. And Birch Bayh was a redeemer. He voted for the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which afforded the federal protections African Americans so desperately needed. And he voted for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which helped secure our access to the ballot box. He was the last living senator to cast a vote for the Civil Rights Act, and while his passing represents one less tie to this achievement, it also reminds us how far we've come and how much we all must continue to keep up the fight for equality. For Indiana's African American community, Birch Bayh was a loyal and dedicated friend. He was not only a strong vote and voice for our rights, but he also, at a time when it was unheard of, he helped elevate African American Hoosiers to positions of power on his personal and committee staffs, and throughout the federal government, ensuring we wouldn't remain on the sidelines. And some of you might even remember that it was Birch Bayh who pushed the nomination of Frank Anderson to be U.S. Marshal for the Southern District of Indiana. He fought against those who wished to diminish our rights, successfully defeating the nominations of two segregationist judges to the Supreme Court. And for women, also too often on the sidelines of public life, he was a catalyst for their empowerment. His efforts to pass Title IX and his impassioned advocacy for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment helped women across America secure greater rights and find their voice. Though the ERA had not been ratified by enough states to become law, we can be proud that it was ratified in Indiana by 1977. Now, with this very impressive record on civil rights and women's rights, it's no surprise that my grandmother, Julia Carson, the first woman and first African-American woman to represent Indianapolis in Congress, saw him as a friend and mentor along with Andy Jacobs. He had her ear, offering advice and perspective throughout her time in Congress. But more important than that, they had a true friendship, and that friendship continued with her son, my friend, Governor and Senator Evan Bayh. You know, growing up, I remember hearing my grandmother talk about Birch Bayh, the fighter, the counselor, the gentleman. She admired his honesty, his conviction to do the right thing, and his willingness to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. Birch Bayh helped create an America where women and people of color were no longer relegated to the margins of society. Largely because of his efforts, so many of us who have run for office and won, helping to create a government that looks like the people it serves. Thank you, Birch Bayh. Thank you, Bayh family. And thank you to all of Hoosiers who served and worked for him and continue his legacy. May he rest in peace.
My assignment from Brother Moreau today is a very proud one. It's to speak specifically about the pride that Purdue University feels in one of its most illustrious and productive and famous of graduates. We're 150 years old this year, and in that century and a half, there is no one who has passed through our university of whom we are more proud, or to whom we owe more for the life they led. It was fun to go back and have a look at his years at Purdue. Some will not remember that having started in West Lafayette, he interrupted his studies. Why? To go serve his country in the Army, military policeman in occupied Germany. So it was not till 3 years later that he came back. And he had a college experience I believe he probably always remembered fondly. He played infield on the baseball team, Golden Gloves champion, proud member of his fraternity, and president of the senior class. He also went to class. I hope he won't mind that I went back and checked the record. Don't laugh, this could happen to any of you one day, you know. No, it was a pretty good record. He had a lot of A's, they tended to be in classes like crop production and farm organization. There were some C's. Two I noticed were in American history and principles of economics. If I'd have known about that a few years later when I was on the opposite side of things from him, I might have said, "You see, I told you." He left his mark on our university, but all of American higher education in such profound ways, some already mentioned. Title IX, of course. Looking at the two most significant ways, it's fair to say, I think, that each was to some extent inspired by his Purdue experience. Title IX, he testified later, looking around his agriculture classes and only finding 2 women, gave him the idea that maybe all was not right, and maybe there were barriers there that somebody ought to take down, and of course he did. He might be pleased today to know that in our College of Agriculture, we have 57% women studying what he did when he was at Purdue. And in a great achievement that might not get mentioned elsewhere, so Moreau put it on my assignment list, he passed a bill across the aisle with another great who is happily still with us, Senator Robert Dole. Let me read you what The Economist magazine wrote in 2002. It said, possibly the most inspired piece of legislation enacted in America over the past half century. This single policy measure helped reverse America's precipitous slide into industrial irrelevance. They were talking about the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, and if it seems a little arcane, maybe the Economist magazine will help you understand how important it is today. Because of that act, the products of genius on American campuses have been moving out into the world in a way that they would not have absent that breakthrough. And I hope that today Senator Bayh has noticed and is a little bit proud that his university is 12th in the world in patents, led the entire American nation in the last 3 or 4 years in new startup companies. This does not happen without Senator Birch Bayh. So that's why Moreau put the finger on me. But he, by leave of the organizer, the committee, I want to just offer a couple other thoughts, because I knew, or thought I knew, Senator Bayh in a different way growing up. I was on the losing end as a college student working for Bill Ruckelshaus, and as an everyday 80 or 90 hour a week a passionate supporter, and Dick Lugar's loss to him in 1974. And then as a volunteer designing a few commercials in the campaign that followed in 1980. And even then, when I saw him as an opponent, one had to have profound respect for the way he conducted himself as both a competitor for office and in office, having succeeded and earned it. This is someone, remember, who won 3 razor-close elections in this state. Probably could have won by more if he'd trimmed his sails and hedged and obfuscated a little bit and played to the gallery a little more than he did. But he was a person of such principle, and he took his chances, that stating principle and acting on principle and not swerving from it would still be rewarded. And I think that those who, in public life, who take that chance and whose wins are narrow ones, in many respects, are those we owe the most to and should respect the most. And then secondly, he was in legislative office where a person can get by with words, can get by with symbols. He was a doer, and it's been illustrated, and I know other speakers will add more examples to it. And this was even at a time when some believe the Senate and the Congress were populated by true greatness of a kind that's not present in every era in our history. A fellow I knew, we were working for different members at the time, wrote a book, sent it to me a year or so ago. Ira Shapiro worked for Gaylord Nelson, if this name is familiar. And he called it The Last Great Senate. And the book is a chronicle of the last years of that Senator Bayh served. And it's a little partisan, maybe, in its perspective, and it's a little nostalgic, as we're all prone to be. But there's a core of truth here. Just think of the names who were among us at that time. Moynihan and Muskie and Humphrey and Jackson. And Shapiro points out Howard Baker, he even gave generous mention to a then new senator from this state named Lugar. And he pointed out there, I think, to us all what is possible in our system when people of that caliber and that courage and that degree of principle are prepared to put national interest ahead of personal interest and to try to look for ways to bring Americans together, not cleave them apart. In 1976, I was utterly convinced that Senator Bayh was most likely individual to be elected President of the United States. It was going to be a wide open race on the Democratic side. I thought he had it all. His record on civil rights, his stalwart loyalty to the organized labor, then such a big part of the Democratic coalition, and all the achievements that he had racked up. There was still at that time a larger rural Democratic vote, and he was the single best representative of all that. In what has to be remembered as one of the most unfortunate slogans or umbrellas to run on, he ran unabashedly as a politician. Takes a politician to get things done. That was the slogan. And it collided with a year when at least some majority was open to the appeal of complete outsider, running totally against Washington and totally against people who work together there to try to make things happen. But I've often wondered, since that experiment didn't work out that well, whether the nation might not have taken a different and more successful course if all those elements had come together the way I, in my naivete, thought they would and made him president. In later years, when I incorrectly thought I was done with any encounters with politics, I had the great good fortune to serve on a board of an Indiana company with him and get to know him in the personal way that showed me how much my respect for him was warranted. I found out, as most people here already knew, that his geniality was genuine, and his empathy was authentic, and his good humor never stopped. And if we're in another one of those times when some of the qualities he embodied seem to have slipped out of fashion or seem to be in short supply, I like to believe that it's temporary, and that, as history sometimes shows us, pendulums swing, and great values and great qualities come back into fashion. So I hope and believe that Shapiro was wrong. It's not the last time we'll see a great Senate, a great national government or leadership of the kind that Birch Bayh represented and that was so prevalent in his era. And if that happens, I'm quite certain that the example of this one great life we honor today will be one big reason that it does.
A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod, thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.
Good afternoon. Kitty, Evan, Susan, Chris, Jess, Bo, Nick, Lieutenant, and Georgia and Josie if they were here. On behalf of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Indiana and the Stinson family, I express our heartfelt condolences at Senator Bayh's passing and our extreme gratitude at having been blessed to know him. I'm honored to be part of this celebration of his life. This is a very special place for me. 25 years ago, Bill and I were married at the opposite end of this hall. And our daughter Jill, who like Katie Morrow, is here with us as evidence that of a byproduct once removed. I'm also the proud recipient of one of those bipartisan Bayh Lugar judicial nominations, and I'm ever grateful for that, as you know. Given the focus of my remarks, I can't help but note that as Granddad Birch Bayh would have chosen, he was equally blessed with 2 grandsons and 2 granddaughters. Our court is housed in the Birch Bayh Federal Building and United States Courthouse, which was named for Senator Bayh on October 24th, 2003. The BBCH, as we call it, because you have to have an acronym if you're in the federal government, is one of just a few federal buildings that was named for an individual who was still alive at the time of its naming. But given all that was accomplished in Birch Bayh's life, there was no reason to wait. There's a phrase made famous by the Department of Homeland Security: if you see something, say something. For Birch Bayh, that might better be reworked as, if you see something, do something. Senator Bayh saw many injustices and did something about them during his lifetime. But I have a time limit, which I've been pledged to honor, and so at the end of my remarks, if I'm speaking more quickly, it will be so I don't get the eye from Bill Morrow. And I will have to save for another day the life-changing and life-saving impact on America's children of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. Today I will highlight the action, the 39 words that have and will change the lives of a majority of Americans. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. When Birch Bayh saw the problem of inequality for women in education, and he saw it firsthand in the discrimination endured by Marvella, he did something. Through Senator Bayh's astute observation of the hurdles faced by the Equal Rights Amendment, he deftly inserted the language of Title IX into the reauthorization bill of the Higher Education Act. After maneuvering past a germaneness objection on the Senate floor, the bill became law and has forever changed the education of American women. I was too young to be a Birch Bayh alum, but I am a beneficiary of Title IX and the mother of 2 Title IX daughters who have also reaped its benefits. One of my college roommates, Rhea Newman of Rushville, Indiana, was the first woman to ever receive an athletic scholarship at Butler University. She played basketball there. Yay, Rhea. And while my lack of coordination prevented me from receiving any kind of athletic scholarship, I did receive an academic scholarship and had every equal opportunity to my male classmates. My daughters and I, and millions upon millions of women and girls, are the beneficiaries of Title IX because the doors to higher education were pushed open forever by Senator Bayh's vision. According to the National Center for Education Statistics in 2016, women made up 56% of undergraduate enrollment. Birch Bayh saw something, and he did something. Senator Bayh's commitment to and advocacy for Title IX extended far beyond his years in the Senate. He successfully wrote amicus briefs urging that Title IX be construed to prescribe employment discrimination in federally funded education programs, and to provide a private right of action for those who are retaliated against for supporting Title IX's protections. Birch Bayh saw something, and he continued to do something. In fact, a few years ago, our daughter Grace was tasked with writing a paper on girls in high school sports. I told her I knew someone who had a lot to share about that topic. She was 12 at the time. So I asked Christopher, who was clerking for Judge Hamilton in our building at the time, if his dad was on email, and he said yes. So Grace reached out to Birch, and don't you know, he not only sent Grace a copy of one of his amicus briefs, he talked to her on the phone about the history of the bill and how life was for girls before it was passed. He saw something then, and he did something. Now, I served as Grace's scheduler during their interaction, and in one of my conversations with Birch, he said, "Jane, these girls today expect to be treated equally." Pause. And he added, "That was exactly the point." I've kept that email chain, and one of the emails I'll share with you today because it tickles me. "Hi, Grace. Please call me on my cell. Birch." His generosity touched us greatly. In 2012, the Indiana Fever hosted a celebration of the 40th anniversary of Title IX, and Birch was the star attraction, along with my colleague, Judge Sarah Evans Barker. That celebration was due in no small part to the work of Kelly Krauskopf, who Bill acknowledged at the outset of our ceremony, the first woman to serve as an assistant general manager in the NBA. In many ways, I see Kelly as the fulfillment of Senator Bayh's dream and Title IX's objective. Well done, Kelly. Well done, Pacers. During his remarks at that celebration, Senator Bayh credited Marvella Bayh with inspiring his commitment to Title IX. He said, quote, "Marvella continued to whisper in my ear, 'Honey, you can't ignore the brain power of 53% of the American people.'" That admonition still rings true. And Senator Bayh took that comment to heart, saw the injustice it referenced, and did something about it. For generations to come, American girls and women will forever share the legacy of Title IX, forged by the will, the wiles, and the wisdom of Senator Birch Bayh. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be with you all, and especially the Bayh family. I will also acknowledge at the outset, I too can feel the Bill Moreau stare. "Keep us on schedule, Governor," and I will do my level best. But today does remind me, as you have all heard, just the enormous, and we don't even need a reminder of this, just the evidence is clear, but just the enormous, the breadth and depth of the contribution the entire Bayh family continues to give back to our state and to our nation. And especially so in Birch Bayh's life. And what is most evident to me, and maybe important, is just how Birch Bayh's service and his effectiveness in the United States Senate truly spans generations, as you can see among us. It's an impact that we're all still benefiting from today and will for many more generations still to come. And every day that he was here not just in this building, but here in the state of Indiana, and every day that he was there in Washington, as you have heard, he was a champion for all of Indiana, for all of our people and places. And you've heard different examples by different speakers, whether it's Farmersburg or Connersville or Bloomington or Jasper. It's amazing to think about his locked-on efforts and his perseverance in the Senate that led to so much of the real infrastructure of our state, from border to border. You think about the involvement he had in the development of dams and reservoirs and harbors and locks nestled all over throughout our state. You know, I travel the world pitching the state of Indiana, and I suspect my predecessors maybe have been on the other end of some puzzled looks as I have when I'm pitching the state and I start to talk about this landlocked Indiana that has 3 water ports. But we all know it's true, and we know what these ports mean, not just to our past, but to our future. They're vital sources of development and revenue generators, revenue that is at a record level as of today. And Burns Harbor up in northwest Indiana wouldn't even be possible without Senator Birch Bayh. He fought for its creation in the 60s. He secured the federal funding for its development. And today, Burns Harbor continues to transport Hoosier-made goods all over the world. He built it, and they came before that phrase was ever cool. And they're still coming, and they're still going. But he didn't stop there, not hardly. When we Hoosiers, or Americans for that matter, are rebuilding after national disasters and natural occurrences, when Mother Nature strikes, we often immediately turn to FEMA for our comfort and assistance. Well, that's yet another big thank you to Senator Birch Bayh. He introduced the Federal Disaster Relief Act. And Birch's vision still forms the framework for the federal disaster relief we have today. And on top of that, this trailblazer also helped establish the original 15,000 acres that created the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, one of our most visited state and national tourist destinations. I'm sure you all know here, earlier this year it became the country's newest national park. There just simply aren't very many people ever who can say they helped create a national park, but Birch is one of those select few. And this is another example of his gift, a gift that keeps on giving. And what I think his legacy, as you've heard by my predecessors speak today, what his legacy is really all about. There's so much more that from my perspective, as I get around the state, I could keep listing all the examples from community to community to community and share story after story, but we'd be here all day. So let me just close by saying, if ever there is a Mount Rushmore of Indiana political figures, surely and certainly Birch Bayh would be on it. There has got to be a quarry down near Lawrence County somewhere, because I can see his limestone smile in my mind right now. For we all know at the end of the day that his monumental devotion to our state and to our nation is only surpassed by his adoring devotion to his family. And they, as are we, were fortunate to learn from the best. So on behalf of his extended Hoosier family, all 6.6 million plus grateful Hoosiers, Kitty, Evan, Susan, Bo, Nick, Christopher, thank you. Thank you for sharing this great and good man with us all.
I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this occasion. I am well aware that it's the middle of a workday and it's the noon hour and you could be doing many, many other things, but you've chosen to take your time to celebrate the life of our loved one with us. I know he would appreciate it, and I know our entire family that's here today certainly does, so thank you. I want to thank the dignitaries who've preceded me to the stage here today. Governor, I want to thank you and the Speaker. We wouldn't be here today without you, and I want to thank your staff. They've been phenomenal, so I'm most grateful to you for that. I want to thank the Congressman Barron for your very generous words. Thank you. And Lee Hamilton, who was like a brother to my father. Lee, I want to thank you. And Andre, you've been like a brother to me, so I want to thank you, my friend. I went for a walk last night just to kind of take in the moment, and I walked down the street and I passed the Julia Carson Transportation Center there. Made me feel good. Made me feel good. I want to thank our senators who are with us today. I want to thank Senator Young, Todd. Senator Young made some very generous comments about my father and about Senator Lugar yesterday or the day before in our nation's capital. And I want to thank you for joining us today, Todd. We appreciate it very much. Joe Donnelly, where's Joe? Joe, is Jill with you or no? Jill? So Joe and the mayor and myself have something in common. I'm recalled when the day Susan and I were married, my father was my best man, and as Susan began coming up the aisle, he leaned over to me and he said, "Congratulations, son. You're continuing a great family tradition." And I kind of leaned over and I said, "Well, what's that, Dad?" He said, "You've outmarried yourself." And he was right. And I'm right too, Joe. And our mayor, thank you. I know my father's smiling down at the thought that it's Birch Bayh Day in our state's capital city. And I know he would appreciate your generous words, even about the ice cream. And I know he would say to all here that he's proud of the job you're doing as our mayor. Thank you for that. I want to thank the members of the judiciary who are here, and Judge Jane, you representing them. My father served for 18 years on the United States Judiciary Committee. The judicial branch of government had a special place in his heart. And so I want to thank you for that here today. I'd like to echo the comments of Bill Morrow and thank the staff of both my father and all those of you who helped me for so many years. My father would be the first to say that life, and particularly political life, is a team sport and that no one gets much done by themselves. And so to the extent that he was privileged to accomplish some things, and to the extent that I was privileged to do that as well, we have you to thank. And I want to thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for your service to the people of Indiana and to the United States of America. Mitch, I want to thank you. Where's Governor Daniels? Mitch, thank you for being here today. Judy, thank you for being here today. In my last conversation with my father, Mitch, I think I relayed to you, we discussed several things, more on that in just a moment. But among other things, the NCAA tournament was still going on. We talked about Purdue basketball. And I reminisced about the fact that my father took me to the first basketball game ever played in Mackey Arena. John Wooden brought his great national champion UCLA team. John Wooden was a Purdue man as well. Back, Rick Mount was on that Purdue team. For those of you a generation, you'll remember that. And it came down to a last-second shot that UCLA pulled it out at the very end. But my father was a Boilermaker. But Michael McRobbie, I want to say, just in fairness to level the scales here a little bit, Mitch, he did get his law degree from IU. So both of our great institutions of learning are represented here today, as through Joe Donnelly as Notre Dame. A word or two about someone who would be here, but could not be here, and that is our dear departed friend, Richard Lugar. It's not very often you can really feel the pages of history turning, and you can see the end of an era. But in the passing of my father and the passing of Richard Lugar, that is, in fact, what we see. We were blessed to have two statesmen of their caliber represent our state. My father had the privilege of serving with Dick for 4 years in the Senate. I had the privilege of serving for 12 years with Dick in the Senate. He was our friend. He was truly a scholar and a statesman, a towering intellect of unimpeachable integrity, someone who was willing to work across the aisle to get things done. I do recall sitting in the Democratic caucus once, and nothing was getting done. No judges were getting confirmed at all. And the Pat Leahy, who Barron referenced, said, well, is there anyone here who has support from any Republican for any judicial nominee? And there was silence. I kind of looked around and sort of tepidly raised my hand and said, well, I think I can. And so we got judges nominated, both Democratic appointees and Republican appointees, because we trusted one another to pick exemplary people who would do an outstanding job on the behalf of our state. So I would say to all of you who knew Dick Lugar and loved him as do we, he may be missed, but he will continue on to live within each and every one of us as long as we remember what makes Indianapolis, Indiana, and the state of Indiana the special places that they are. 2 moments of personal privilege. I'm delighted that you got to see our sons. It's hard for me to believe that 23 and a half years ago, we were bringing them home from St. Vincent's Hospital here in Indianapolis to the governor's residence. I guess if you feed them for 23 years, this is what happens. They graduated from college last May, and I'm delighted that they did well. Their grandfather would be pleased, Mitch, for me to report that there were no C's on their report cards, and in fact, not many B's. So they had a lot of opportunities and could have chosen to do just about anything with their lives. They chose to serve our nation in the military. I think that says a lot about their values and their character. There's no greater blessing that parents could have. My sons, I'm proud of you. And finally, our former First Lady, my wife Susan. It's been a challenging year for Susan. She's been fighting a deadly disease which has involved multiple surgeries and a whole host of treatments and side effects that I won't get into here today. But I do want to say that I have loved this woman for 34 years. Over the last 11 months, I have come to admire her even more. Never a complaint, never a tear shed. Last week, I asked her, I said, you know, sweetheart, this is going to be a hard journey for you. Maybe you should let the boys and me handle it. I think we can take care of it for the family. She looked at me and she said, well, if I weren't sick, would we all go? I said, yes, sweetheart, we would. She said, well, then I'm going. So I'm delighted she could be with us here today. A couple of more lighthearted observations and then a few brief, more serious remarks, and then I'll pass the baton to Christopher. I'll never forget my father's last political speech, campaign speech, on his own behalf, Barron. It was 1980. It was a hard-fought election, as Mitch would attest. We went all over the state. I was in 90 of our 92 counties. It was so hard-fought that we got on a small plane and flew down to Warwick County to shake hands with the workers at the Alcoa plant because of the hour time difference. The polls hadn't closed there yet. And we could greet the workers coming off of their shift, many of them who would be then going to vote, and hoping them to vote for my dad. Well, 1980, it's an occupational hazard. You know, 1980 proved to be one of those very difficult years. 10 Democratic senators went down to defeat that year, and my father was one of them. We flew back to Indianapolis, got off the plane. They told us what the polls were showing. We went back to the hotel, showered, changed. We went down to the campaign headquarters on the west side of town. Here was a converted auto dealership, so it had a very spacious display floor there, which was now filled with probably 2,000, 3,000 people. We're lucky that the fire marshal hadn't gotten wind of this because he would probably shut the thing down. In any event, so we arrived. There were banks of cameras there. All the national networks were there, the New York Times, the Washington Post, everybody. to see how the great man would handle his political adversity. There were tears being shed, there were hugs being given. The crowd was pretty down. My father came out on the stage, got behind the lectern, cleared his throat, looked at the cameras, and said, "I would like to thank more than 1 million of my fellow citizens for encouraging me to take up the practice of law." The tears dried up, the frowns went away, and people knew it was just an election, and there are more important things in life than that. The next morning, before dawn, we got up and went out in the dark and the snow to the Ford plant here in town to shake hands with the workers coming to work. The election was over. He'd lost. There was nothing to be gained. He was there to say thank you. Elections come and go, but friendships and loyalty never should. The second story I'll tell is somewhat analogous to the one that the mayor told. My father was legendary for his love of ice cream. I was telling the senator he was an ice creamaholic. Much to my mother's consternation, he would eat half a gallon of ice cream, but just leave a little sliver so that he could say, "No, honey, I didn't eat the whole thing." He literally knew where every Dairy Queen was located in the state of Indiana. He traveled with a spoon in his briefcase so that when they'd stop, he could kind of feed his habit. And so in my very last conversation with him, he was failing, and I talked to him by FaceTime. Kitty was kind enough to get him ready for that. And I asked him how he was doing. He said he was doing fine, that Kitty and Chris were taking excellent care of him. We talked about old times a little bit. We talked about Purdue a little bit. And then I asked him, I said, "Well, Dad, I hope you're getting some ice cream, and I hope it's good ice cream. I hope it's good quality ice cream." And he paused and he said, "Well, never had any bad ice cream." So a sense of humor and grace in the face of adversity until the end, I think we call that class. So for just 3 or 4 minutes of more serious reflections, because I think the occasion requires it. Since the beginning of history, mankind has struggled to define what makes a life worth living. How do we define a race well run? Well, of course, there are many answers to that question, and no one right one. But one of the first attempts to answer it comes from ancient times. It was in the 6th century BC. An Etruscan army was descending the Italian peninsula, intent upon sacking and pillaging the city of Rome. Rome was not the great empire it would become, and was mostly defenseless before the onslaught. But to buy itself some time to assemble their forces and marshal a defense, they sent a company of soldiers out to defend a bridge over one of the rivers on the approaches to Rome, to hold off the Etruscans for as long as they could. It was a suicide mission. The commander of the Roman troops, after positioning them across the bridge and before the battle commenced, looked at his soldiers and spoke about their impending fate. His name was Horatius, and this is what he said. He said, "For death must come to every man, be it soon or be it late. And how can a man die better than in facing fearsome odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" My father devoted his life, often against fearsome odds, to defending the ashes of our fathers and our mothers and the temples of our gods. We call them the Constitution of the United States, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a nation in which all of us, regardless of race, creed, color, or religion, can find equal opportunity and a chance to make a better life. A society in which every one of us, regardless of whether we come from the humblest house in the land or the richest house on the hill, can be treated with the decency and respect which should be the birthright of every Hoosier and every American. Of course he was an idealist. Of course he was a dreamer. But he was also a pragmatist. And as one or two of the previous speakers have noted, he was a doer. He understood the fundamental difference between an elected official and a statesman, and a political scientist or a pundit or an editorial writer, or the inflexible ideologue or the strident partisan. The fundamental responsibility of the elected official is to get things done that will help people in their daily lives. And so he set about attempting to do just that. He ran for re-election in 1968, as Mitch noted. It was a great historic political year. Robert Kennedy's first contested primary was right here in the state of Indiana. Kennedy crisscrossed our state and later the nation, often ending his speeches with a quote, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and ask why not." My father attempted to bring those words to life. Why not a society in which our mothers and wives, our sisters and daughters, have equal opportunity in the great institutions, or learning institutions of Indiana and America, and on the playing fields? And so, there was Title IX. Why not a nation in which the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who wear our nation's uniform and were fighting to defend us in the jungles of Vietnam and the other conflicts where our nation had sent them, why not allow those young men and women to participate in the democracy that they were fighting to defend? And so there was the 26th Amendment to the Constitution that they gave those soldiers and the other 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote in our nation. Why not a country, as Mitch mentioned, in which the cutting edge of science, new cures, new medicines, new discoveries could find their way out of the laboratory and into the doctor's offices and hospitals of Indiana and America, so that patients facing dreaded diseases would have access to those cures and can enjoy the benefits of life and the high quality of life. And so there was the Bayh-Dole Act. I had the privilege of being with Senator Dole a few years ago. I mentioned to him how much my father enjoyed working with him on the Bayh-Dole Act. And as only Senator Dole could do, he cleared his voice and he said, "It was 80% Bayh, 20% Dole." Why not a nation, as Judge Jane mentioned, in which first-time nonviolent young offenders would no longer be locked up with hardened criminals, and we would give those young people a chance to redeem themselves and lead productive lives as law-abiding citizens? And so there was the Juvenile Justice Act. And why not a judiciary that all of us can look to for impartial justice, regardless of favor or birthright? And so when a man was nominated for a position on the United States Supreme Court, who had openly and proudly said, and I quote, "I yield to no man in my belief in white supremacy," my father made sure that that man and those beliefs found no place on our nation's highest tribunal. Of course, in these hyper-partisan and hyper-ideological times, it might be easy to look at my father's record and conclude that he's something of a relic, a man out of his time, a man from a different era. It is true that although a proud Democrat, he was not a strident partisan. When I was a boy, it was not uncommon that Republican senators would come to our house and have dinner. That's just the way it was. Some of his most significant collaborators, Richard Lugar, Bob Dole, Senators Percy, Packwood, Hatfield, Brooke, Javits, others, Everett Dirksen, were all Republicans. It didn't matter. It didn't matter to him. What mattered was doing what was right for the American people. I think perhaps it was his military service, or the fact that he came of age during the Cold War. He knew that there were greater threats to our nation's liberty than members of a different political party. He knew that the sons and daughters of Lincoln and the heirs of Jefferson and Jackson have not been sent here to wage war upon each other, but instead have been sent here to take up the struggles against the ancient enemies of man: ignorance, poverty, and disease. And so he did. When I went into public life, I often marveled at the courage that it must have taken to take some of the stands that he took. As Governor Daniels pointed out, his elections were always close. The first one by less than 0.1%, the second by 4%, the third by 4%, the fourth he lost by 8%. In those days, some of these positions were not universally favored by the electorate. But he understood. He understood that there are worse things than losing an election. And one of them is not standing for anything. And so he did. I never once knew of him to take a poll or conduct a focus group to try and determine what the right thing to do was. He knew what the right thing to do was. Do what's moral, what's just, what's decent. Let that be your compass. It may not find favor in the next election, but it might in the journals of posterity. So let me conclude with one final reflection. What lesson can we take away from this man's life? What can we learn that might benefit those of us here in the days that we have left? Perhaps history can once again be our guide. When you go to Monticello and you go behind the Great House, you can follow a gravel path down through the garden, and eventually you come to a family burial plot. There are about a dozen or 15 headstones there. And in one of them are chiseled the following words. It says, "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the law for religious freedom for the people of Virginia, founder of the University of Virginia." Legend has it that Jefferson wrote his epitaph himself, but before his passing, he shared it with a friend to seek his friend's advice. His friend looked at what Jefferson had written and said this. He said, "Mr. Jefferson, nowhere do you mention it, not once but twice. You were accorded the highest honor that can be given to an American citizen, the presidency of the United States. Nowhere do you mention that you were given the second highest honor that can be given, the vice presidency of the United States. You do not mention that you were Secretary of State or Ambassador to France. You do not mention that you were governor of your home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Surely, Mr. Jefferson, surely you must mention these things." To which Jefferson replied, "No, my friend. I would much prefer to be remembered for what I have been privileged to do for others, rather than for what others have so kindly done for me." We gather here to remember the life and the legacy of Birch Bayh, a man who devoted his life to doing for others, and in so doing led a life worth living and ran a race well run. Let each of us, in our own way, go forward from this place and endeavor to do the same.
I'm deeply comforted today to see so many warm and familiar faces, folks from public life, folks from private life, some staunch political allies, some perhaps technically rivals, but all of you dear friends. With such a long and dynamic life as my dad had, I'm always learning new things about him. I'm learning new things today. I didn't know Mayor Hogsett's Dairy Queen story or Speaker Bosma's airport story. I didn't know the magnitude of my dad's impact on Indiana's ports. I didn't know that they taught economics at Purdue. Sorry, Governor, I couldn't resist. But in reflecting on my dad's public and private life, for many weeks now, I've been struggling thinking of what to say in his memory, how to capture what he meant to me and what he meant to all of us. There have been so many wonderful and poignant comments and memories that have been shared today, many on the public servant that he was, many of them on the man that he was. Me, I wasn't there for his legislative achievements, but still, to me, Birch Bayh, my dad, was larger than life. For his professional success, sure, but much more than that, for the incredible model of virtue and selflessness that he was, the incredible fountain of love that he was in my life and so many of ours. There are so many wonderful memories of my dad that I want to share with you from childhood and from adulthood. I want to tell you about how he taught me how to hit a baseball, how to backhand a ground ball, and how to throw a slider. I want to tell you about each of the 100-plus ball games we went to together. I want to tell you all about each of the many science projects he'd helped me with. One on the solar system, because I was fascinated by space. One on Canada geese, because they lived in the park near our house. One on potholes, because they were a scourge in the city in which we lived. Thank goodness those times are behind us. I want to tell you about each of our hikes and camping trips, whether overnights up the Potomac or a week in Yellowstone. I want to tell you about childhood's tough times, or I would blow a game, I'd fail a test, and there were plenty of C's and worse, by the way. Or where I'd make a bad decision, but my dad was always there for me to make sure that I knew that he loved me and was proud of me no matter what. I want to share with you the joy he had for life, whistling gospel tunes or Sousa marches, singing aloud to Hank Williams or the Statler Brothers when no music was playing. And for no reason in particular other than it was great to be alive. He'd spontaneously show his affection to me and my mom, all his loved ones and friends, with hugs and winks and air punches. And sometimes just exclamations of gratitude to God. I want to tell you how he loved my friends, in particular my best friend Deontay, and how he loved my law school sweetheart, now wife Jessica, and made clear to them that they were family and would always be. I want to tell you all the stories and examples in which he showed me how to be a husband and how to be a father. I'm going to tell you all about how at 90 he'd have tea parties and crawl around on the ground with his granddaughters. I want to share all these incredible memories with you in detail, one by one, because they mean so much to me. But of course, doing so would take hours and hours, and even as long-winded as Dad could be, I think even he would appreciate some brevity here. Plus, what I really want to share, more than the memories that I'll treasure forever, is what he meant to me, what it meant to be his son. It is impossible to truly capture that in words, and in thinking of my remarks today, I've struggled to do that. I think the best I can do, the best words I have, are in this letter from a long time ago. June 27th, 2001. Dear Dad, I spent a few days considering exactly what I should get you for Father's Day. I considered the traditional options, another tie, and so on. I landed on another alternative, and that is this letter. With these words, I would like to convey something beyond how much I love you and how much I appreciate all that you have done for me in my soon-to-be 19 years. You know how much I love you, and you know that I would be lost without you and your invaluable support and effort to make me the best person I can be. Here are some additional things that I've observed over the years that I think need to be said. Dad, you always tell me how proud of me you are, whether I succeed or fail, whether I'm riding high or suffering disappointment. I've always tried my hardest to make you proud, and you have, in turn, maintained that in coming up short of my goals, I could never disappoint you. This approach of yours has given me not only relief and comfort, but also the self-confidence and perhaps courage to tackle the toughest of life's assignments. Words cannot express my gratitude for this. You have never failed to voice your pride. However, I don't think I've ever expressed how truly proud I am of you. You've accomplished more in your life than most could ever dream of. You've traveled the world, met some of the most influential figures of the 20th century, and served your country as a soldier and a senator. The credentials and accomplishments stretch for miles. I would love to have the experiences and the success that you enjoyed, but the success itself is not as important to me personally, nor was it to you. Instead, I hope to model myself after two particular aspects of your success. The first is your effort and perseverance, whether it be running a firm, raising a family, or just staying in shape. You attack life with everything you have, giving everything you do your very best effort. Second, throughout your life's adventures, you've always maintained your principles and your integrity, never selling out to superficiality or succumbing to vanity. I've watched you live 19 years of your life, and I've heard about how you live the rest. Watching you live by these two essential qualities, I have learned that your way is the only way to live one's life and truly succeed at being an exceptional human being. One could not ask for a better role model. Dad, you know I have few dreams of grandeur. I have no realistic aspirations to become a doctor or a ball player or the president. Right now, all I know is that I want a family, and I will raise my children with the principles that you have instilled in me. I only hope that I can live my life with the same integrity, perseverance, and patience with which you live yours. You have given me so many priceless treasures, and today I want to take the opportunity to make sure that you know it, and that you know how eternally grateful I truly am. Please never forget how important you are and will always be to me. Your loving son, Chris. I love you, Dad.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, everyone. Your father, both of your fathers, is crying tears of joy and gratitude. Christopher, he loved naming you after the first Bayh who emigrated from Württemberg, Germany to Owen County, Indiana in 1864. Dad would say to you what St. Francis said to others on his own deathbed: I have done what was mine to do. Now you must do what is yours to do. The eulogies today attest to what the Talmud calls, quote, the imperishable crown of a good name. But Birch would not take credit. He would want us to remember his mother, Leah Hollingsworth, who was taken from him by cancer when Birch was only 12. He would thank his sister, Mary Alice, for loving him through their shared grief all the days of their lives. He would thank his father, Colonel Bayh, for his example of service to his country and who taught him to be a feminist. Birch would tell you about his early years when the family moved to Washington, D.C. from Shirkyville, Indiana, because Mr. Bayh, Colonel Bayh, was recruited to be the director of physical education for the D.C. school system. Birch would tell you about returning to Shirkyville at age 14 in the care of his maternal grandparents while his father was in China during World War II training physical education to fighter pilots. But back while they were in Washington, when Birch was about 10 years old, one morning at breakfast, his dad said to the family, "I'm going up to Capitol Hill today to testify to the DC Appropriations Committee." Young Birch said, "What are you going to tell them, Daddy?" And his father said, words Birch never forgot, "Son, I'm going to tell them that little girls need strong bodies to carry their minds around just like little boys." That was 1938. Birch would credit his grandmother, Kate Hollingsworth, for showing him that women were equal partners on a farm. That was 1940. He would thank his grandfather, John Hollingsworth, for modeling how it's always best to listen to your wife. As in the time when young Birch wanted to enter the Campbell's Soup tomato growing contest, but his granddad said, "No, I'll stick with corn and soybeans." Whereupon Birch heard his grandmother say, "John, if the boy wants tomatoes, he will have tomatoes." He used the proceeds of that contest, which he won, to put himself through Purdue. From those formative years on the farm, Birch learned everything he ever needed to know about private and public life. He learned to cultivate, taking care, he said, not to hurt the roots. He learned patience. From feeding chickens, milking cows, combining wheat, putting up hay, putting down hay, driving horse plows, washing the linoleum kitchen floor, and being the first up in the morning to light the coal stove for his grandmother, Birch learned hard work. He learned how to harvest. He learned fence mending. He learned teamwork. He would credit Maravella for giving him his bachelor's degree in prejudices faced by women. He would thank his heroes, Billie Jean King and Edith Green. He would thank former Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti and his venerable law partners for giving him a second career in the law, and mostly for allowing him so many unbillable hours while he continued to work to safeguard Title IX when it was under attack. He would, through tears, credit the love and comradeship of men he called brother. Brothers like P.A. Mack, who was his fraternity brother at Purdue, and who was the best man in both of Birch's weddings. P.A., who Birch called little brother, and who was the very first to welcome me to Birch's life. P.A., who at 90 years old himself, rushed to a plane and drove himself across rivers and fields to be at Birch's bedside in his final hours. Lee Hamilton was a brother of 70 years. Lee, Birch felt your embrace up until the end. He loved your weekly phone calls that came without fail. He felt loved by you, and he loved you back. Baron Hill gave Birch the greatest honor of his life by introducing legislation to rename the Indiana Federal Building and Courthouse after Birch. I think, Judge, you said it's called the BBCA? Well, around our house, it was called the Big Rock. And at the end, Baron honored his friend by honoring me and Christopher. We thank you. Milan Panic was another good friend. Milan, my brother, I'll always hear that sweet greeting he had for you. You too came at the end, flying all day from California the minute I called. I told Birch you were coming, and when you arrived at his bedside, he said, "I waited for you, brother." John Feerick worked with Birch on the 25th Amendment a half-century ago, and in more years brought him to Fordham University to teach a whole new generation of students about presidential and vice presidential succession. He also took every call Birch got in the last 24 months about that law. Without John Feerick and the American Bar Association, there would not have been a 25th Amendment. But Birch would say that private citizens were always the engine of government. He would say that young people like the Yale law students who helped him comb the record of a Supreme Court nominee kept a racist judge off the bench. It would not have happened, he said, without the Yale law students. Birch would also say that sometimes in life you need a plan B. When the Higher Education Act came up in the early 70s for renewal, and Birch thought of the women who were routinely denied academic choice, where they could not attend the college of their choice or a discipline that they wanted to study. So he took the education component of his Equal Rights Amendment, which he was afraid he might not get out of committee, and he sat down and dashed off those 37 words, one sentence, which is now called the Magna Carta of women's education. Birch would say that sometimes it is simply goodwill among colleagues that saves the day. His last effort, the Bayh-Dole Act, was opposed and effectively killed by fellow Senator Russell Long. But in the lame duck session after Birch lost in 1980, Senator Long called him and said, "I don't like your bill, but you've earned it." And so we have as somebody here today said, the most inspired piece of legislation of the last half of the 20th century. Historian Adam Goodart gave Birch a job he loved as much as being a senator, teaching students at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. Adam, too, kept vigil at his brother's side. And when Birch's work on earth was done, Adam wrote for the obituaries the first draft of history. Birch would want me to tell you that all the historic legislation struggled to complete for a place in his heart once his Washington College students took up residence there. He believed them to be the custodians of our future, and he loved passing the baton. Former student and now senior producer of Morning Joe, Jack Bower, wrote, "Birch took us through the legislative dogfights he won and lost, but most of all, he inspired us to make a difference. He was a great American and, to me, a loving and loyal friend." Another student, Jeremy Rothwell, wrote to me. This one will be harder for me to get through. Quote, "Listening to Birch spoke reminded me of that line from Alfred Lloyd Tennyson's Ulysses, 'Tis not too late to seek a newer world." John Mathis blessed Birch's retirement years by love and affection. Neighbor Dick Shabe knew the way to Birch's heart with his weekly dates to the ice cream shop. As Birch lay dying, his good friends Clay Raley and Don Wooders wrote, "We can't help but think of poet and priest Gerard Manley Hopkins on this blessed night, tragic as it is. Hopkins's Kingfisher's poem comes to mind with his verse, Christ plays in 10,000 places through the features of men's faces, including Birch's. I have received the embrace of my William friends who loved Birch and who he loved back. Joyce Kravitz, here with me today, Jan Smith, Georgianne Thanos, and Linda Hashen have been my Sacagaweas through Birch's final journey, and they are my companions in grief. Birch was not afraid to die. He said he was worried about me, but he also said that he knew that he could leave me in the embrace of Jill, Ursula, Sue, and Vicki. Pam Gardner, also here with me today, has taught me as Shakespeare taught her to give sorrow words. Caregivers, Georgetta Camacho and Rose Marks, were Birch's ice cream co-conspirators to the very end. When one or the other of them would walk through the door, Birch would greet them with, you don't happen to have anything chocolate in that bag, do you?" Countless neighbors and friends have remembered the pot of soup Birch made for them when they were sick, the ice he scraped from their walk every winter, the chicken wire he built around their vegetable garden to keep the rabbits out. Christopher's friends, especially Deontay, he loved you, Deontay, have remembered the father figure who, quote, enrolled me at IU and stocked my dorm with essentials from Target. Who knelt in the warm earth and taught me how to grow lettuce, another said. Who was a shining example of how we should conduct ourselves as men and citizens. Who could eat a tomato like an apple. And who, quote, because of Mr. Bayh, I grew up knowing it was brave for a man to cry from a poem. The poet Mary Oliver wrote, "Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine." My despair is losing my husband of 38 years. I never had to be a politician's wife. Marvella had those harder years. Instead, I only had to bask in the legacy that they built. The writer Donald Hall spoke of what he called third things in a marriage, the things that couples do together, essential things that provide a joint rapture or contentment. Such third things, he said, such as the symphony, Dutch interiors, or Monopoly. One of the third things that Birch and I shared was the love of poetry. We read to each other, we cried over lines of verse, sharing why a particular metaphor resonated with us. We met every Friday at noon with a group of other poetry lovers. Jane Kenyon was a favorite poet. Birch loved her poem, Let Evening Come, for its imagery of the farm when she wrote, quote, "Let the light of the afternoon shine through chinks in the barn, moving up the bales as the sun moves down. Let it come as it will, and don't be afraid. God does not leave us comfortless, so let evening come." Poetry was one of Birch's ways to the promised land. He loved Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Okay, I loved Emily Dickinson. He stood with Whitman, who said, quote, "Not until the sun excludes the earth will I exclude you." He stood with Mary Oliver, who said, "I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood." But it was William Cullen Bryant's poem, Thanatopsis, on how we should approach death that Birch committed to memory. The last verse is, "Thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust, approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams." Mine was the man who always carried a pocketful of $5 and $10 bills for the homeless at his subway stops, who loved our home on the Eastern Shore because it reminded him of Indiana. He'd say, "There are lots of cornfields, and they wave to you from their pickup trucks." Mine was the man whose garden harvest was so large that the neighbors would draw their curtains when they saw him coming with more cucumbers. Mine was the man who planted his marigolds and tulips in rows like they were corn. "Drifts, honey, drifts," I begged. whose life was bookended flying his own plane in his 20s and walking 3 miles a day in his 90s. Mine was the man who never, ever talked about himself, who had a beautiful tenor voice, sang in a barbershop quartet, played guitar, mostly Peter, Paul, and Mary, and taught himself a bit of piano, mostly Scott Joplin, who was a light, heavyweight boxer who also loved to dance in the kitchen to the Statler Brothers. The man I loved was a man of many enchantments, leaving me love notes by the coffee pot when he left the house early for work, or notes under my pillow when he was out of town. He was a great listener. In a photo album of Birch with constituents over the years, I am struck that in every single photo, Birch is doing the listening, not the talking. His voice was a library of kindness. He never asked a thing of me which made me want to give him everything. He was a man of no complaint and no argument. Birch was a man of faith, of belief, yes, but faith as a verb. As our priest, Frank Wade, always reminded us, belief is hearing the music, faith is dancing to it. Birch was the Good Samaritan. He was a servant. He was the fruits of the Spirit. At the communion rail every Sunday, while receiving the body and blood of Christ, he always prayed that I may be worthy. Christopher and I kept vigil at Birch's bedside for 7 days. It was sacred time. Christopher shaved his father, just as Birch had shaved his own father on his deathbed. We prayed alongside Father Bill Ort when he administered the last rites. We witnessed Birch speaking to God and his wonder and awe that God spoke back to him, "It's okay, it's okay." Sorry. I loved you for 40 years, Birch. You were my kingdom come. Thank you.
Please remain standing for the benediction by Reverend David Hamilton, which will be followed by the playing of taps, and then we will sing Amazing Grace together. That was one of Birch's favorite songs.
Thank you for including me, Bill. Thank you, family. Senator Birch Bayh was a progenitor to many, as has been eloquently shared today. I did not know him personally, but as a young college student, I was an intern under then Governor Evan Bayh right here in this Statehouse, and had aspirations of attending law school after college, took a different route. God called me into the gospel ministry, and so I attended seminary and met the then Secretary of State, Joe Hogsett, who I have the honor of serving now as deputy mayor under his tenure as mayor. And so we remember a great man. Let us pray together as we honor his memory. O God, whose mercy is bountiful and whose comfort is boundless, accept our prayers on behalf of your servant Birch Evans Bayh Jr. as we celebrate his entrance into the land of light and joy in the fellowship of your saints. Now to him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy, to God our Savior, who alone is wise, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Amen.